Okay. Um, we're starting from question 5. How did they get their name?
The Harlem Hellfighters were given their name by the Germans, who truly feared them. And in war, there is no greater compliment than when your enemy is afraid of you. Uh, because when the Harlem Hellfighters first went into combat, they were magnificent warriors. And remember, the Germans had been fighting the French and the English for years, and they'd never seen anybody as tough as the Harlem Hellfighters. Uh, so they called them the Harlem Fighters from Hell, and that's how they got their name. Because the one thing the Germans didn't want to do is go up against them.
So another question is, can you tell us who the most famous Harlem Hellfighters were?
Yes, there were a few of them. One of them was James Reese Europe, and James Reese Europe was a superstar in his day because he was one of the creators of a music called jazz. And I know jazz is nowadays, jazz is something that like a few old people listen to and a few hipsters with berets listen to. But back in the day, jazz was America's first uh, native music. And this is really important because what makes a country? You know, what makes a country different from other countries is its culture. You know, the food we eat, the clothes we wear, the language we speak, and the music we listen to. And up until jazz, the only music America had was borrowed from Europe. We just took their music and their fiddles and whatever and their waltzes. And suddenly there was this new music that was didn't come from anywhere but America. And Jim Europe was one of the founders of that. And he was a superstar. Like in New York, he sold out every night. He was making money. He walked in any restaurant, people get up and cheer. People loved him. And he gave all that up to go serve with the Harlem Hellfighters. Because their commanding officer asked him, I would love for you to form a band, like a band within the Harlem Hellfighters, and to march with us into Europe and to show the Europeans what American jazz is all about. And Jim Europe said, okay, I will do that. I will give up the money. I will give up the fame. I will give up my comfortable living because Jim Europe lived well. And he gave it all up. And he said, I will do that on one condition. When the shooting starts, when the Harlem Hellfighters actually get into combat, I want to be fighting. I don't want to be there with a little baton telling a band to play music. I want to be in it. And he was in it. And when the Harlem Hellfighters first went over, he was a band leader. And he brought his jazz band all around France. And that is why to this day, the French love jazz more than the Americans. To this day, because of him. And when the shooting started, he put down his band leader baton and he picked up a machine gun. He was captain of a machine gun company. So a very famous man, Jim Europe. Another famous man was Henry Johnson. Henry Johnson was one of America's first war heroes, black or white, in World War One. And he was not a tough dude to look at. He was a little guy. He had worked as a porter on the trains. You know, yes, sir, can I take your bag, sir? And that was it. But one night, he was in the middle of no man's land with another soldier, and they were jumped by like 40 Germans. And Henry Johnson fought them off by himself because Private Roberts was wounded. So he fought him off with grenades and then his rifle when his rifle ran out of bullets, and then he had nothing left but a knife, and he wailed on them. And he sent them running. And he was one of America's first war heroes. And right after that, he was given the French Croix de Guerre, the Cross of War, big French medal. And it took about 100 years for him to get the American Medal of Honor, which shows you how the Americans felt compared to how the French felt. But these were very, very famous guys to come out of the Harlem Hellfighters.
Next question is, where did the Harlem Hellfighters fight?
They fought. They fought in on what's called the Western Front. The Western Front was essentially the border between Germany and France. And during World War One, it almost never moved because both sides had strung up barbed wire and machine guns. And guys would get out of their trenches and they'd walk into the enemy machine guns and they'd all get slaughtered. And the Europeans did this to each other again and again, year after year. So these guys fought in some of the worst way you could imagine. Trench warfare. So imagine you're sitting in a big hole in the ground and there's mud and lice and rats and your feet start to rot. You get something called trench foot, and the food is terrible. And every now and then the enemy would bombard you with cannon shells, so you'd have to dive for cover and hope you didn't get killed. And every now and then those cannon shells would have poison gas. And poison gas doesn't go up like smoke, it goes down. So you have to dive for cover so the explosions don't kill you. But then you're sitting there in the gas. You got to put your gas mask on. And you can barely breathe. But if you take your gas mask off, you die. This is what they had to go through fighting on the Western Front.
Okay. How did they end up fighting with France?
Well, what happened was the American army didn't want them. The American army had a plan for black soldiers. They were going to turn black soldiers into workers. That's all the plan was the white boys would fight and become heroes, and the black guys would build roads and unload ships and dig trenches and do all the manual labor that the white boys didn't want to do. And the Harlem Hellfighters said, "Oh no, absolutely not. We're trained for combat. We are combat soldiers. We're going into it. We are going into it." And so the French army said, "We'll take them," because remember, France had been in the war since 1914. This was 1917, almost 1918. Too many of the white boy soldiers in France had been killed. France needed soldiers, and they didn't care what color you were. Now, also because France had an empire, some of that empire included West Africa. And so the French had used black West African soldiers. And those guys had fought so well that the French thought, hey, wow, maybe all black people are awesome fighters. So they heard, America has black soldiers, we'll take them. And so the Harlem Hellfighters ended up fighting with the French army. And for the first time in their lives, they were treated like equals. They were treated well, they were treated with respect. And when they did something heroic and gallant, they were rewarded. So that was all new.
Okay. Question number 9 is, what were the ideals of the Harlem Hellfighters, and how were these ideals not compromised during World War I?
The ideals of the Harlem Hellfighters was never retreat, never lose a trench to the enemy. That means don't let the enemy ever capture your trench. Don't ever run away, and don't ever let a fellow soldier be captured. That was a big deal, because you don't want to be captured by the enemy. You don't want to be taken prisoner. It's better to die than to be taken prisoner by the enemy. That was their ideals as soldiers, and they did it. They never lost a trench in the whole war. And by the way, the Harlem Hellfighters served longer than any other American unit. They served 191 days, and in all that time, in 191 days, they never lost a trench to the enemy. And they never lost a man to capture, no matter what. And you saw that with Henry Johnson, Needham Roberts. Johnson saw Roberts being captured. He was wounded, and some Germans were picking him up, were carrying him away. And Johnson could have said, "Hey, better you than me, buddy." And Johnson could have hid and let them go away. And he didn't. He pulled out his knife and he jumped on those Germans. So they lived by their code of being the best soldiers you could possibly be. And they were.
Okay. And for our last question we're going to ask you is, why were the Harlem Hellfighters important and what made them famous?
Oh, well, those are two different questions. What made them famous was how amazingly they fought. Because it wasn't just that they were black soldiers. It's that they were great soldiers. 191 days in combat, like I said, is